Very good evening to all. I'm Bimbara Ratnayaka, and it's my utmost pleasure and honor to welcome you all to today's highly anticipated event, the Research Paper Writing and Publishing webinar, organized by the IET Young Professionals SriLanka, IET Young Professionals Bangalore, IET On Campus University of Peradeniya, and IET On Campus KDU. For those who may not be familiar, the IET is the Institution of Engineering and Technology. We inspire, inform, and influence the global engineering community to engineer a better world. As a diverse home across engineering and technology, we share knowledge that helps make better sense of the world in order to solve the challenges that matter. So, we are doing this webinar in conjunction with the Young Professionals Technical Conference. It's an exciting opportunity for young undergraduate students to showcase their technical skills and innovative ideas. The event involves collecting research paper submissions from undergraduate students, which are then evaluated by a team of experts. Selected research papers are then presented in front of a panel of renowned professionals, where they can receive valuable feedbacks and insights. The two best projects are awarded and sent to the annual technical conference, a conference open for engineers in the society, which is organized by the IET Sri Lanka network. The YPTC provides an excellent platform for young professionals to learn, network, and gain recognition for their skills and ideas. During this webinar, our esteemed speaker will be sharing invaluable insights and practical tips on crafting a successful research paper for academic journals. We hope that this event will prove to be a valuable resource for all those in attendance. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you a productive and enlightening session. Without taking much time, with great honor, let me introduce the guest speaker today, Professor Dolphy M. Abraham, who will deliver a remarkable session. We are privileged to have in our midst today an esteemed academician and expert in the field of systems and operations management, Professor Abraham. Professor Abraham's impressive credentials include being a former professor of systems and operations management, as well as a program director of the doctoral program at the Alliance School of Business, Alliance University. Prior to this, he served as the Dean Academics at St. Joseph's College of Business Administration, Bangalore, and was a professor of Computer Information Systems at the College of Business Administration in Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles, USA for 15 years. He earned his PhD from the Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business, University of Pittsburgh, and has a keen interest in the study of how information technology impacts managerial decision-making and drives organizational change. Professor Abraham's wealth of knowledge and experience make him an invaluable resource for today's session, and we are grateful to have him here with us. As a friendly reminder, we will be holding a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So please feel free to send any questions through the chat box. As you may already know, to value your participation, we are offering an e-certificate. To ensure that everyone is accounted, we kindly request that you to fill out the form when it passed around in the middle of the session through the chat box. So, without further delay, I would like to invite our guest speaker, Professor Abraham, to take over the session. Over to you, sir.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome and introduction. I'm very happy to be here It's not just that my research area is, I'm interested in research, but more importantly, one of my very big interests is in helping young researchers, especially in getting started with research. So my last step in my career was as the director of the doctoral program at Alliance University. And it was very rewarding for me because I had the opportunity to work with first-time researchers, several of them who went on to complete their PhDs and have been able to publish papers on their own. So after they have finished their PhDs, they have been doing their own research and being successful at publishing their own papers. So I'm very happy to be here and to take part in this session. Let me start by sharing my screen so that I hope all of you can see the presentation slides. Okay. If it is okay, let me go ahead. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the writing of the research paper. So one thing to note is that means I'm not going to be focusing on how to carry out the research project. I'm only going to be focusing on the writing of the paper, and specifically the writing of a paper for an academic journal. Once you learn or once you develop your skills to write a paper for an academic journal, it's easy to translate that to writing for a conference, for a technical conference or any other kind of conference, and for even just for presentations. So this presentation, I'm hoping, will help you start developing those skills and give you a starting point from which to work on. So let's talk first about what I would hope that you are able to take away from this presentation. There are four main things that I'm hoping that you will get from this session. First thing is understanding the objectives of writing a research paper. So what is the real reason for writing a paper? Second is understanding the review process. So in order to publish the paper, it goes through a review process. If you have not gone through the process, then you need to have a good idea of what goes on in that process and how to deal with that. The third part is what are the key elements of the research paper? So this is where we get into the different sections of the paper. What do you need to put in each section? How do you emphasize the key points in that and make it into a good paper? And finally, through all of these elements of the research paper, one of the key things that you need to know is how to emphasize your research contribution. So I'm hoping that by the time we get through the end of this presentation, you will have these key takeaways that you can take back with you and use as you start to work on writing your own papers. So the outline that I'm going to follow, first, let me get into objective of the research paper. And it may seem simple to think that objective is just, oh, I need to write a research paper, I want to publish something, but it goes beyond that. If you want to be a good researcher, the objective is much deeper than that. And then we'll get into the types of research papers. So this also you need to have an understanding of this because you wind up, the papers, different types of papers require you to write them in different ways. Sometimes they emphasize some things more and less than others. We are going to focus primarily on journal papers today, but you can take those lessons and apply it in other areas. Then we'll get into the review process itself. What is a publishing process? Then we'll get into the elements of the research paper, and then I'll take you through the submission process that happens with the journal. So what happens after you have written the paper and before you submit? And then once you have submitted the paper, what happens during the review process? So this is the outline that I'd like to follow for today. So if I want to state what is the objective of the research of a research paper, the objective needs to be that you add to the body of knowledge in a specific research area by explaining your contribution to that research area through a specific research project that you have done. right? So you'll notice that there are some keywords out here. There is a body of knowledge that we are talking about, right? And the body of knowledge I'm talking about is a subset in a research area, right? And then we're talking about your contribution, and your contribution coming through a specific research project. So first of all, there is a reference point here, which is this body of knowledge. And there is also a research project that has got a contribution to this body of knowledge. So to give an example of a body of knowledge, let's take this. Let's take an example of computing technology. Okay. Computing technology is a very, very, very broad area, right? As I'm sure all of you understand. There is just a starting point, you have hardware and software, but that is again, like big, huge subsections in and of themselves. So when you say computing technology, when you're talking about a research area within computing technology, it's going to be a much more narrower field. Just for the sake of argument, or just for the sake of an example, let me use the example of a sorting algorithm, or algorithms that help you sort data, right? So this is another fairly large research area within computing technology that looks into sorting algorithms, right? So within sorting algorithms, there are even subsets of bodies of knowledge where maybe you have a sorting algorithm for specific types of data, right? And so the body of knowledge here now is a specific subset of sorting algorithms, right? And your contribution now is, if you develop a new sorting algorithm, if you can show that your algorithm is better than the ones that are out there, you have got a contribution to this body of knowledge, right? A research paper helps you explain that contribution to the community, to the research community. So all of those other people who are interested in this area of sorting algorithms, by writing a paper, you are now explaining to them what it is that your algorithm adds to that body of knowledge. Okay. So the research paper that you write, the primary purpose there is to explain your contribution. That is the contribution that is a result of your work. Okay. So then, as I said, a body of knowledge now is a specific set of research in the area. It deals with a set of questions that people have been studying, right? So now what you need to know in that research when you're writing up the paper is, what has been the prior work in this area? Unless you know the prior work in the area, you cannot explain your contribution. You need to have that reference point, correct? So then when you explain your contribution or your addition to the area, it is based on this prior research in the area. And then you can also now say, what are the boundaries or limits of your contribution? So what are the boundaries within which your work contributes to this research area? So to go back to that example that I was using of a sorting algorithm, when I'm talking about boundaries or limits, you probably, depending on what the algorithm that you have developed, you will now say that my algorithm works in these particular conditions, maybe with certain types of data, maybe with certain volumes of data, maybe with certain types of character sets, whatever it is, you will now specify your boundaries or limits. So now all of the researchers in the area know that the value of your algorithm, the algorithm that you have proposed, comes in a particular way, in a specific area of sorting algorithms for certain kinds of data. Your algorithm provides some value. Okay, so that is what you need to convey through that research paper. The third part of this is that when you're talking about conveying this research through a paper, your objective is also to help other researchers, right? So the way that you write the paper and the way that you explain your contribution, you are helping other researchers understand what you have done. You're helping them understand why your work is a contribution and why it adds to the body of knowledge. You help them understand how the prior work is related to yours. And you help them to carry out their own research. So just like when you go through the prior research and you understand the nature of the field, your paper is now going to help other researchers understand the state of the field, not only of your work, but how your work is connected to the prior work. Okay, and when we're talking about prior work over here, it can mean multiple research areas that you pull together. So for instance, if I go back to the broader area of computing technology, but let's take there is computing technology that can be used for medical treatment, right? So maybe it can be things like data from MRI scans that have been analyzed to diagnose diseases. There is a lot of data analysis, which is computing technology related work. So here the prior work is not only in terms of medical healthcare data about diagnosis of diseases, but it's also about the computing technology, about data analysis, about data capture, what kinds of computing technology have been used for this. All of that comes into the prior work, right? So the body of knowledge now is links computing technology as well as the medical field. It's not only in one area. Okay, so these are the key things. So if you look at a research paper as the way in which you help other researchers by explaining your contribution clearly and showing how your work has contributed to the body of knowledge. Okay. So next, let's move on to the types of research papers. And here I've got it in terms of, organized it in terms of looking at it by research outlet and looking at it by the content of the paper. So the research outlet. And here I've organized it in the form of what is considered to be the higher standard to the lower standard, right? So peer-reviewed journals are considered to be the highest standard of a research outlet. So these, and even within journals, there are top-tier journals, there are mid-tier and lower-tier journals. The top-tier journals are the ones that the most important work typically appears. These are the journals that are referred to the most. The lower-tier journals are probably not referred to as much. But there again, you can have some very good papers that appear in lower-tier journals, and as a result of which, they are also referred to widely. You next have peer-reviewed conferences. And the difference between a journal paper and a conference paper is a conference paper is typically shorter. So some conferences the paper length will be as short as 1,000 words, which is maybe what, 3 to 4 pages. The longest conference papers may be 2,500, 3,000 words, which is about 6 or 7 pages. Journals, on the other hand, are typically somewhere between 4,000 to 10,000 words, right? So now you're getting into some papers which may be as long as 30, 35 pages of printed double-space printed text. So the journal papers are a lot more detailed. They may describe work that is much more broader in nature. They cover bigger problems, and the work itself is more detailed. Conference papers are typically shorter. They are much more narrowly focused on more specific, narrowly focused problems. And as a result, the papers are also shorter. So they cannot disclose as much details in a conference paper as you have with a journal paper. Now, when I talk about a conference paper, not all conferences publish the paper. Some conferences only have a presentation. They may publish an abstract, but they don't publish the whole paper. They only do the presentation and then an abstract. Others, you have a proceedings, which will have the full paper, right? So if you have a presentation and a brief abstract only, if you don't attend the conference, you're not able to learn from there. But if they have proceedings, it's possible for you to refer to the proceedings and learn from those papers. The third one is you have peer-reviewed books and collections. So a lot of publishers will get editors. They will get people to become editors who put together collections of books, collections of papers in a book or in a collection. And these are typically, they invite authors who will submit their papers. Those papers are reviewed, and then it appears in those books and collections. You next have invited talks and papers. Okay. You have invited papers. Just 1 second. You have invited papers where an organization invites people. So just like how you have invited me to talk today, right? There are other research papers themselves that are invited where, and some, it's not just talks, it can also be papers, right? So you may invite somebody to write a paper. And then finally, you have journals, conferences, and books and other collections which are not reviewed. So any paper that gets submitted is accepted and it appears. There is no quality standard for those journals, conferences, or books. So as a result of which, very often those things are not referred to very much. Okay. When you start looking at research papers by content, here what you have are the different types of research projects that have been carried out and what is described in the papers. The most common type would be empirical research, meaning research involving data being collected and analyzed, right? And in the engineering and technology fields, experimental work is going to be one major subset of empirical research, right? You have other types of data, but experimental work in particular is something that comes up a lot in engineering and technology. You also have a lot of papers that develop or propose a particular model or a framework or an algorithm, and they test it out. So they propose an algorithm and they validate it. That's also very common in engineering and technology fields. Literature review papers are those that go through the literature and analyze what has been done so far and present it in a way that is useful for other researchers. Okay. So it's not based on collecting new data from somewhere. It's the data that they're using essentially is the prior literature. And finally, you have conceptual papers. So the difference between a conceptual paper and a model, framework, or algorithm development is in a conceptual paper, there's typically no validation. Somebody is proposing an idea, right? So even conceptual papers can appear in peer-reviewed journals. Typically, they will ask a prominent researcher to write a conceptual paper, and that person is proposing some ideas based on their prior work experience in the area and their knowledge of research across the whole field. They may write conceptual papers. Even in business settings, you see a lot of conceptual papers that are positioned as white papers. So they're proposing certain kinds of ideas, but it's not tested or validated. So those are just ideas. They're just presenting a concept and without testing it. You also have some literature review papers which are conceptual, meaning they use the literature review to develop a new idea. So there their basis for the new idea is based on the literature review, right? And finally, you have meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is where you take the data from prior papers. So you ask all of those different authors to provide you their data. And now you take all of the data from multiple papers in a particular area and you analyze it together to come up with an understanding of what is the work in that area, right? So in a literature review paper, you're just looking at the papers as a whole. In meta-analysis, you're actually taking the data and rerunning it in a particular way to understand what has been done in the area. Okay. So how are these papers published? And the key word to keep in mind over here is peer review. So most in the research world, you rely on peers, other people just like you, to review the papers. So in conferences, this is typically a faster process. You have an editor and 2 or 3 reviewers. The reviewers review the paper, they give their comments to the editors make a decision, and it's typically a yes or no decision. And here there are timelines. There is a conference on a particular date. So I just saw the announcement that there is a submission deadline of 15th April for the technical conference. So the submission deadline is 15th April. The conference is going to be held on a particular date. Between that time, the review process has to take place. So the timeline is much shorter, and it's typically just a single round, right? So it's an accept or no accept decision, and that's it. In journals, on the other hand, you have multiple rounds of peer review. There are multiple levels of editors, and you have typically 3 or more reviewers for each paper. The timeline can be much longer. So in my field, in business, the top journals, for instance, the papers can take 2 to 3 years to go through the review process. So from the time you submit a paper, so if I submit a paper now in March of 2023, some of those journals, this final decision may happen only in 2026. So it can take a long time, right? So the top tier journals the timeline may be much longer. So each and every journal has got a different timeline based on the types of papers that they consider and their review process. It's highly variable across the different journals. So at journals, what is the review process? The submission starts with you submit the paper. Along with the paper, you provide a cover letter. And I'll talk about the cover letter in a short while. The initial review is done by a senior editor. So this can be the editor-in-chief of the journal. It can be another person that they give you a senior editor. But what this person does is they're trying to answer the question, does this paper is it likely to make a major contribution to the subject area? And the subject area here is a subject area of the journal. Okay, so it is not a broad area to this thing, but they're focusing specifically on the subject area. And they decide whether should it proceed to the rest of the review process or should it be rejected at that stage itself. Okay, and that reject is referred to as a desk reject. At the top tier journals, somewhere between 50 to 60% of the papers, sometimes even more, are desk rejected, right? So they receive a very large number of papers. Only a relatively small percentage of that number of submissions goes through for the review process. And the senior editor has got the task of reading the paper, doing a quick review to figure out, is it worthwhile taking it to the next round of review? Okay, so if it proceeds to review, now you have an associate editor who reads the paper more carefully, figures out what the area is, identifies 3 or more reviewers, right? So reviewers are typically people who have published papers in the area, right? So the editor keeps track of people who are writing papers in this area and invites them to review the papers. Keep in mind that these reviewers are doing this completely as a volunteer task. They are not paid for it in any way. They are spending their own time and effort to review the papers, right? And in most cases, the associate editors are not paid. The senior editors may have a payment from the publisher, but it's also possible that they're not paid. Okay, so all of this is voluntary work. So the peer reviewers, what they do, they get a set of guidelines provided by the journal, right? And they have to follow those guidelines to evaluate whether the paper is acceptable for the journal. In this process, there is what is known as a blind review process. So you either have a single blind or double blind review. A single blind means the reviewer knows who the author is, but the authors do not know who the reviewers are. In a double blind review, the reviewers don't know who the authors are and the authors do not know who the reviewers are. So the process is designed to make it as impartial as possible, even though it is possible that you get to know the people who are working in a particular area, so you know whose paper it is, but typically it is an impartial process, right? Most of the time, the reviewers get 4 to 8 weeks. Again, this is variable according to the different journals. It can be longer or shorter, but typically 4 to 8 weeks, somewhere in that time frame. The decisions that they make, so the reviewers read the paper carefully. They get this time to read the paper carefully. They will be given some criteria to put some numeric scores typically. The decisions that they come up with. So the first one is a clear accept. So they're perfect. They're happy with the paper as it is. They think it is perfect and they say accept it. This is extremely rare, right? They're very, very rarely, especially for the first submission, right? As I said, there are multiple rounds possible. So when you first submit it, an accept is rare. Accept with minor revisions is also rare. So here they say that your paper is good. Everything is good. We are accepting the paper, but we need you to make some changes. So this can just mean sometimes major, some minor changes in terms of editing the paper, explaining some things in more detail, changing some figures or tables, things of that nature. But the ideas within the paper stay the same. Nothing has to change. Here also, this is also a smaller percentage. The largest percentage are going to be revise and resubmit. So here, what the reviewers are saying is there are some things that have to change in the paper, substantial changes, right? And these changes can be moderate changes, meaning the nature of the problem does not change, the nature of the work does not change, but they're asking you to do maybe some more analysis, some more explanation, some more literature analysis that you have to add and discussion you have to add. The major revisions can mean they may ask you to run new experiments. They may ask you to restructure the problem in some way and redo your analysis and see how it goes. So in all of these revise and resubmit, when you resubmit the paper, it goes back to the same reviewers and the review process is repeated. It does not go back to the senior editor. It will go back to the associate editor and the peer reviewers, but they will repeat the review process again. So here again, they get another 4 to 8 weeks to review the process, right? The final decision, the other last decision is a reject. So when they feel that, if they feel that the paper has no scope of reaching a point where it is good enough, they will reject the paper. So a reject can happen even after you have revised and resubmitted the paper. They may feel that, okay, your revisions are not good enough. We are going to reject it at this stage, right? So the reviewers, the 3 or more peer reviewers, make their recommendation. The associate editor and the senior editor make their decision. And they send you a review report. That review report contains the actual reviews that these peer reviewers have written. There will also be the comments from the associate editor and the senior editor. Some journals will even show you those numeric scores for the different criteria. All of that is typically disclosed to the authors so that the authors can distinguish. So typically when you get a review report for anything with revisions, the editor specifies what are the revisions you have to make, right? So they will refer to the specific comments from the reviewers and say, please address these comments, right? And when you resubmit the paper, you have to explain how you have addressed those comments, okay? So this is the overall review process by journals. And you can see that this is a fairly involved process. It takes time. And what they're really looking for is the quality of the paper, right? So the top tier journals take this process very seriously, and therefore they spend a lot of time and effort on this. Okay. So now let's start getting into working on that paper itself, right? So what does this process mean for you? What is it? How does it now connect to the writing of the paper itself? You need to start thinking of the journal. What are the journals that are appropriate for your work? What are the research areas that you are interested in? What kind of work have you done and what kind of papers are you likely to write? Which are the journals that are appropriate for you? How selective are those journals? So the top tier journals, these are the main journals in the field. Some of them, their acceptance rate is very low, 5 to 10%, meaning 1 in 20 papers that are submitted to them are finally accepted and appear in the journal. Somewhere between 1 or 2 papers out of 20 are accepted. The lower tier journals are better. They can range from 1 in 10 to almost like 6 out of 10 may be accepted, right? So there's a large number of journals available, and they cover the full spectrum of quality of journals. So you need to choose your journal wisely, because if the work that you have done is extremely good, you don't want to send it to a lower tier journal. At the same token, if your work that you have done, you know that it's not the top tier work. This is not something that is going to last, meaning it's not something that people are going to refer to 10 years from now, then probably a top tier journal is not the best place, right? So with all of these journals, the criteria that are used to evaluate are roughly the same. Most journals follow the same thing. So you have what the criteria that they look is the appropriateness of the research area, the your level of contribution, the quality of your literature review, data analysis, findings, and their writing. And a very important part there is the research questions and the research design. So how have you defined your research question? And how are you going to design the research project itself? Okay. So these become the elements of the paper, right? So you start off with the title, abstract, and introduction. So this is not even getting into the actual research itself, but each of these are important elements. Then you start getting into the prior research. So if you take a look at the previous criteria, the literature review, the quality of the literature review, this is where you start getting into the prior research or the research foundation. Then your research questions, defining what it is exactly that you have done. The research design is how you have designed the study, then you get into how you have carried out the study, what is the data that was collected, how you have analyzed that data, and finally the findings and conclusions. So these are the different elements of the research paper. I'll now take you through each one of these. So let's start with the title, abstract, and introduction. Okay. These three elements are very important because the senior editors, this is what they really focus on. They don't have time to read the full paper, typically. So when they don't have time to read the full paper, these are the three things that they will look at closely. The title is also something that is very important. Be very specific as to what your work is, right? And when you come up with the words, use the common keywords that are used in the research area. In the papers that you have read, what are the common keywords that you have used or that have been used? Use those keywords to describe your work and be as specific to your work as possible. Say exactly what you have done in your paper, correct? Here is where you need to know how these papers, these titles are used. When Google, for other people to find your work, the place that they're typically going to start is through a Google search window, right? And so when they are trying to Google your paper, they're going to use those common keywords, right? So if you use words that are not commonly used in that field, they're not going to find your papers. So think in terms of how, if somebody were to do a Google search, how would they find your paper? What would be the keywords that they would find the paper? The next is the abstract. So the abstract, in a lot of cases, there is a word limit. Typically, it is 100 to 200 words. Each and every journal will specify their own word limit, but 100 to 200 words is the typical, right? What you want to put in your abstract is your research question, your approach, your design, and your main findings, correct? You're not going to be talking about the background of the work. You're not going to be talking about anything else except your specific work. The abstract is not an introduction to your paper. The abstract is basically a 100 to 200 word summary of what it is that you have accomplished in your paper. So one of the key things to do, there's a tendency when you're writing your first papers to copy paste from the introduction. That's the mistake because you will not put the right content in there. Okay. So within the paper itself, the introduction is the first section. Think of the introduction as a hook as to how do you hook the reader into reading the rest of your paper, right? So that senior editor who's reading your paper, if they have a limited time and they get to the introduction, so they have the title they find interesting, the abstract they find interesting, now they get to the introduction, they want to see more details. This is your chance to hook them in, where after they've read the introduction, they feel that, yes, this is a paper that I will spend some time reading the full thing. Therefore, I'm going to send it to the associate editors and the reviewers, right? So in the introduction, what you need to emphasize is, why is your problem interesting? What is the importance of the problem? Why is your approach to solving this problem interesting? And then why are your findings interesting? Right? So you're using the section of the paper to sell the paper, basically, right? You want to use the section to make sure that anybody reading your paper will actually read the rest of your paper as well. They will not say, this is boring, and put it aside. You want them to get them to read the whole paper. Okay. So the editors read these three sections very carefully. Your best chance to avoid a desk reject is to focus on this. Keep in mind, the introduction is only about 10 to 15% of your whole paper. So it's not a long section. My suggestion is, do not write the introduction when you start writing the paper. You may note some points down that you want to put in your introduction. Write your introduction after you have written the rest of the paper. Typically, what you want to do is the introduction section and the conclusion section, you work on it at the end of your writing process and you work on it at the same time. Okay. So once you have written the rest of the paper, you have a good understanding now of what to emphasize, and therefore you have a better idea of how to write up the introduction. So the next section, this is where the peer reviewers focus a lot of attention now, is the prior research in the area or the research foundation of your paper. So in this section, you are providing the basis for your contribution. You are now explaining in detail what is the reference work based on which you are carrying out your work, right? So you identify the different literature areas, you identify the key issues from this literature, and then what are the key papers on these issues. So you need to go in this order. You need to start from the issues. So what are the main points, the problems that have been identified in the literature? Then you say, okay, these are the different papers that have addressed these problems, right? And once you have identified the issues and the papers, now you can say, what are the limits of this existing literature? So maybe, let's say, for instance, I was using that example of a sorting algorithm, right? It could be the case that there are certain types of sorting algorithms. The last set of work done on it was long time back. And compared to that, computing power is much better now. Therefore, you are able to do something different using those sorting algorithms. So the limits of the existing literature is those algorithms were developed at a time when the computing speed was much less and capabilities were much less. And therefore, the algorithms had a limit on their capability. Now we can do something different, right? So in this research foundation section, you identify these limits and you explain why these are limits, right? So the reason for why in the sorting example or sorting algorithm example, you're saying that this is a limit because computing capability has increased substantially, and therefore we have the ability to do something more. Therefore, it is a limit, correct? So when you go through the existing literature and you identify these limits, it's very likely that you will find several limits. It's not the case that you're going to work on all of them. So in the research foundation section, you typically end with saying that what are the gaps that you are proposing to address? Okay. And so you are now setting the boundaries or the scope of the work that you are proposing to address. Okay. So now, before we get into that, and so here is where we start getting into your specific research question. So before we get into that, let me take a few minutes to talk about how do you actually do that literature review, right? And so here I'm not talking about writing up the section itself, but the work that you do prior to writing up the section. So when you are doing or planning or preparing to write a paper, you need to go back through the literature, find those papers in conferences and journals that have worked on the similar problem. My suggestion is that you create a spreadsheet organizing all the papers that you have read, right? And a spreadsheet is a very easy tool to use and very, very useful in this context. My format that I would suggest to you is put keep for each paper, take one row. And the column headings, in the first column, you put all the details of the paper, right? The title of the paper, author, publication outlet, all of the things so that you can find that paper again. What is the area of that paper, the research area of the paper? What is the method they have used? What are the key findings that they have used? And then identify what are all of the relevant criteria of that paper for your work. So now, because you're in a spreadsheet, you can add, mix and match, or organize these columns any way that you want to. As you read each paper, take your notes in the spreadsheet. And you can modify these columns as you need, right? So whatever is appropriate for your research work, you can come up with the different column headings for each of those. Okay. The benefit of putting this in a spreadsheet is that you can use the spreadsheet tools to now sort through this data to find out subsets of papers that have certain criteria in them. Right. So the moment you cross between about more than 5 or 10 papers, it becomes hard to take notes on paper or in a Word document. This is much better done in a spreadsheet. So my suggestion to you is start maintaining these spreadsheets as you're reading the papers. And it becomes very useful to you when you start working on writing the papers. Okay. So then let's move on to explaining the research question. So when you have identified the scope of your work, right? So you have said what are the things the gaps that you are going to address. You can now state the specific question you are answering in the paper, right? So based on the gap you have identified, what is the question? Or there could be more than one question at some point. So what are the question or questions you are answering in the paper? And now you also need to specify the boundaries of your work. So you want to state very clearly what is it that you're looking at, and also what is it that you're not looking at. So what is not included in the scope of your work? Okay. So let's say if I use that example of that sorting algorithm, you may want to say that the scope of your algorithm excludes certain kinds of data sets, right? It excludes certain kinds of sorting method, or it excludes certain kinds of results, okay, or certain types of sorting activity, right? So it is intended for a specific type of sorting activity, and that's the boundary of your work. Once you have stated that question, you need to explain why that question is important. So why is it necessary for that sorting algorithm to be developed? And here you're going back and summarizing what you have found through your literature review as to why the existing work is not sufficient, right? So when you answer this question, you are determining the contribution of your work. You're explaining what is the likely contribution of your work. So anybody else reading your work knows now this is what this person is trying to contribute. Okay. The reviewers of papers, the peer reviewers in particular, and the associate editors as well, this is one of the things that you have to convince them first, right? So they look at the literature review section and the research question section to see whether they think this is a worthwhile paper. If they think that this question is not worthwhile, the rest of the paper is really not interesting to them anymore, because they'll not even spend too much time on it, because they will say that, okay, the question itself is not interesting. Why am I going to spend my time going through all of the data analysis and so on, right? So when you're writing the paper, you need to spend a lot more time on the literature review section, the research foundation section, and the research questions section. You need to think very, very carefully when you write these sections, okay? So next we get into carrying out the research itself. Okay, so when you have a research question, now you have to come up with a way to carry out that research. This is where you start getting into the design of the research. So the research design is basically your approach to answering the research question. There are lots of different methods available out there, depending on your specific area of research interest. There can be several different types of methods. In a lot of cases, you can even borrow methods from other areas, other disciplines, right? And you can use that to carry out your research. So there's a lot of this thing, but the most important thing is in the research design section of the paper, you are explaining why this was the best or the most appropriate for your question, right? So I've heard of I was listening to a presentation once, and one of the people in the audience was saying that this person was looking at some data, applying some data analytics, right, to gauge customer opinions. And the question that came up with was, wait, you're collecting, hundreds of thousands of customer comments and doing a text analysis on them. Why do you need to do that when I can read about 10 of those comments and I can get a good picture of what's happening? Why do I need to analyze 100,000 comments when your analysis shows me that most of them say the same thing? Correct? So what that person who made the comment was saying was questioning was the appropriateness of the method. Why was that data analytics method the most appropriate when there were other methods that were much more simpler, right? You get the same answer with a simpler method, so then why should you go for a complicated method? In your research design section of the paper, you need to make the justification very clear as to why your method is the most appropriate. It doesn't have to be the best, right? So sometimes the best method may require you to use resources that you don't have. So saying that you can make the argument that given the resources available, this is the most appropriate. That's fine. Okay. In the research design section, you also get into the details. What is the research, the model that you're actually using? Are you looking at cause and effect? Are you looking at statistical correlation? In that model, what are the key variables that you're going to measure? Right? So antecedents and consequence are basically the variables that you're measuring to see cause and effect. Correct? And so what are those variables? Where will those variable values come from? So what is the data that you will use to execute the design? Are you going to just do observations? Are you going to do surveys? Are you going to run experiments? All of these different things you will explain in your research design. You will also use the prior literature to explain how some of these methods have been used before, and therefore people have shown that this is useful in the same type of problem area, and therefore you are also going to use the same thing. Okay. The next part, if it comes to carrying out the research design. So here you're saying, okay, here is my research design. Here is how I carried this out. And in this section, what you're going to do is explain and say that, okay, this is how I carried it out. Here is how I got the data. Here is what I tried to do. Here is what actually happened. You want to disclose all of those relevant details that are relevant to the study. So what did you actually do to carry out the project you designed? So those of you who are in the process of doing a research project, my suggestion to you is to maintain a diary when you carry out your research project. And every step of your research activity, whatever task that you're doing, right? Whether, let's say, you're running an experiment or maybe you're collecting observations, make notes in the diary as to what you have done. When you write this research design section and implementation of the research design, the research diary becomes very useful to you. Okay, but you have to do that when you're carrying out your research work. You can't start on that, obviously, later. But once, if you have that diary and you have been maintaining that, it becomes very useful to you when you write up the research design section of your paper. Okay. So once you have written that part of it, you've explained how you have carried it out. Now you get into the details of the data. So once the reviewers are convinced of your research question, your research design, now they get into the details of how you actually carried out your research, and the data is what they focus on. What data did you use in your models to draw your final conclusions? Okay. So there is, again, wide variety of data for every research problem. You can carry it out in a variety of different ways. These include things like field observations, simulations, surveys, running experiments and doing observations as well as results from experiments. You can even use data from historical records, economic data. Like, say, for instance, if you're looking at infrastructure-related questions, right? Historical records about infrastructure projects, economic data about infrastructure projects become important in that context. You can even use data from other published sources, right? So there could be data available in other places, other agencies that have collected data that could be useful for you. All of that are relevant types of data. Broadly speaking, there are two types of, all of this data fits into two sets. You have quantitative and qualitative data. The difference basically is that for quantitative data, you have statistical tools available to you. For qualitative data, you do not have statistical tools. You have to use other techniques. So in non-engineering fields, qualitative data is quite common, and they have a variety of different kinds of techniques that are used there. So they don't rely on statistical methods typically, but mostly for quantitative data, more often than not, it is data that on which you're applying statistical analysis. Okay. When it comes to data collection, you also have to keep in mind the ethical considerations that come in. And this is particularly relevant when you're submitting papers to a journal, because some journals they ask you this question about the ethical standards that you have followed in data collection. So here, what you get into is any kind of data that you have collected from other humans, as well as other living organisms, comes under this purview of ethical standards. So if you're collecting data from other organizations and things like that, or economic data collected by some government agency, this does not come into the picture. As long as the use of that data is legal, you don't have any problems, right? But when you're dealing with people or living organisms, you have to explain what standards you followed, right? And the basic principles that come into the context here is when you're dealing with humans, was there informed consent? Meaning, did that person who participated in your study know what they were participating in, know that they could refuse to participate, right? Did you design your study in such a way that no harm would come to the participant in any way? That can mean physical harm, mental harm, emotional harm, right? So Institutions typically have an institutional review board or a research ethics committee. So whether you're in an educational institution or whether you are in a corporate institution, if you're carrying out research, typically there needs to be an institutional review board at the university or at the company, corporate, where they look into this and make sure that you are not introducing any risk to the university or to the company through the research that you're carrying out. So typically what you would say in the research paper is that, yes, you followed these ethical standards. These were reviewed by the institutional review board or the research ethics committee, and here is the approval number for that. Right? So there is typically a formal process, and you would mention that. But this is necessary, like if you're doing a paper that say you're proposing an algorithm and you're validating that algorithm through some test, you don't have to worry about this. Okay. So once you have got the data, now you start getting into the analysis and findings. So in the analysis of the data, you start with explaining the validity of the data you have collected, meaning you have to explain that there was no bias in the data that you have collected. There were no mistakes that were introduced into the data because of the way the data was collected. And if it's quantitative data, there are statistical techniques to do the validity. It depends on the data that you have, right? So once you first have to show that your data is valid. Then you get into the techniques that are used to analyze the data. Okay, so here again, you have to go back to the literature. You have to justify that the techniques that you're using are appropriate. And you typically do that by saying that for similar types of data, for similar types of problems, these were the techniques that were used, right? And then you explain the result, then you display it or you describe the result of your analysis. And here again, when it comes to submitting to a journal, most journals have got guidelines for how it should be formatted. So the layout of the tables, if you're using charts, how the chart should be laid out, what kinds of analysis results have to be presented, all of these things in the journal submission guidelines, they will tell you what you need to provide. So you need to read those guidelines carefully before you write up this section. In some cases, you may also have to provide a sensitivity analysis. So certain kinds of problems require you to do this. So you're proposing a particular kind of model or algorithm, then you'll very likely have to provide a sensitivity analysis as well. Okay, so at this point, what you have is you have carried out your research, you have described how you have done that, you have described your data, you have described the result of the analysis that you have done. It is after this that the real value of your paper becomes prominent. Okay, the way that you make your contribution prominent is after this. So here is where you start getting into what is known as a discussion section. So it can be referred to as findings, it can be referred to as discussion, but here is where now you are saying, I have done all this work, this is the analysis that I have done and the results of the analysis. So what, right? What is it that I have found? So here is where you get your chance to explain your findings. And what you're doing at this is now towards the end of the paper. What you're doing here is now connecting the results of the analysis to what you had written earlier in the paper. Okay. So the first thing is the analysis that you have. Do they prove or disprove your hypothesis? So the research question that you have and the research design that you had, there may be specific things that you were testing by carrying out the data and the analysis, right? Collecting the data and the analysis. You connect that back to the research design now. So you take the results of the analysis, go back to each of those things that you were going to test, which you would have explained in your research design section. And now you explain and show what is it that you have found. Then you go back broader and say, based on these findings, based on what has been proved or disproved, what can you say about the research question that you stated, right? Have you answered that question? In what way have you answered the question? Is it complete? Is it partial? What are the different elements or sub-questions that were answered? Okay. Now, based on that answer, based on what you say that you have done with respect to your research question, you now connect it back to your introduction and literature review sections and say, now when I look back at the broader research area and the prior research that I have looked at, here is how I have added to the body of knowledge because by answering the research question, these are the things that I'm able to say. Okay. So in your discussion section or your findings section, you are connecting the research work, the result of your project, you're connecting it back to the literature eventually. Okay. In this section, you also discuss what are the limitations of your findings. You need to be upfront about this. This is not something that you need to hide from. It is important for other researchers to know what are the limits of your work, and it's better for you to state them instead of the reviewer coming back and saying, you know, you said that you have done this, but these are the limitations that I can see. If you state it up front, they know that you have done a thorough job, right? So you need to discuss your limitations. Now, based on all of this, based on your findings, based on your limitations, it is naturally going to lead to new research questions that can potentially be done. Sometimes you may want to write this up in your paper, but if you are, let's say you're in research and you're planning to carry out this research further, maybe you don't want to provide too much detail. Maybe you just want to stop at the limitations and mention briefly further research questions. Okay, so this is a call that you have to take based on your specific situation. Okay, so this is basically all of these are the different elements of the paper. To get through a journal, the most important thing is to emphasize your research contribution. So the key things that you need to explain very carefully through your paper is the research question is very important. The reviewers need to be convinced that your research question is important because it addresses a limitation in the current body of knowledge. They need to be convinced that your research project, the way that you have defined it, will or has addressed the limitations. They want to know that your findings as a result of that project has definitely now brought in something new to the field. And they want to know that you know what are the limits of your research, right? So that you know exactly that from your findings, what is the limits of your work. If you can convey these 4 points in your paper in such a way that it's clear that there is a contribution, the chances are that your paper is going to be accepted because you have covered the main points that reviewers are looking for, and you are likely to convince them that your paper has got contribution. Okay. So now, let me talk about references now. Be very careful with the references. When you write the actual manuscript, there are two places where references come in. You have citations inside the body of the text. So when, let's say, for instance, you have read some papers, you have identified some issues that need to be addressed. When you talk about those issues came from somebody else's work. So you need to cite those authors, those papers, correct? So during the writing of the paper as you write the paper, there will be several of these things that you need to cite. So you have what are called as citations inside the body of the text. And at the end of the paper, you have a list of all of those references where for each of the citations that you have in the body of the text, you have provided a full reference for how people can find those papers. So let me just take you to the IEEE reference guidelines. Let me make this bigger. Okay, I hope you can see this on screen. So this is the PDF file that I got from the IEEE Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, I think. And they have a lot of different journals which may be relevant to you. They have it's a 40-page document that explains how to write references. And here they've got examples of how. So if it's a book, what is the format that has to be followed? So your list of references is going to be in this format, okay? So in your list of references, you would mention this. And now this is appropriate for IEEE journals. Other journals may have different reference guidelines. So for the journal to which you submit your paper, you need to find out which is the appropriate reference guideline, right? So this is how and they explain to you all of the different types. So if it's a book, so different types of books with a chapter, books with editors, conferences and proceedings. Here are the abbreviations to use, the basic format, the specific examples, conference proceedings in print, what I was telling you earlier. So all of these different types of things they have explained. And then if we go back up to the top, they even show how to cite the references in the text. It says references need not be cited in the text. So in IEEE journals, they want you to number the references in the list of references, and they want you to put the numbers inside the body of the text, correct? When you need to refer to the author's names, you would say author and author's name, and then the reference in the text, the number in the list of references. So this is IEEE's guidelines. Other journal publishers will have their own guidelines. You need to find out what is the appropriate for you. Okay, so this is something that is important for you to pay attention to. If you skip on the list of references, reviewers will take a look at it and say that this list of references is not good, done properly. They will reject the paper because they feel that then the rest of the paper is also not written well, right? So when you start writing the actual manuscript, start with the journal's submission guidelines, read it very carefully, okay? So when I went to the IEEE, I was using IEEE as a place to find some of this. And IEEE has got a lot of different journals. Each journal has got slightly different criteria. So you need to start with the specific journal that you have in mind, find their submission guidelines from their website, go through that, read that very carefully, make sure that you understand what they're asking. If not, ask somebody and find out what it is that they're looking for, right? Before you start writing your paper, right? When you write the manuscript, all of those different elements that I talked about of a research paper, write it in your own words, right? Do not copy and paste from other people's work. That is plagiarism. Most journals will have electronic tools to check for plagiarism. If they detect plagiarism in your work, they not only will they reject your paper, they will not allow you to submit papers again. So be very careful. Write it in your own words. Keep the language simple. You do not have to write in complicated, flowery language. Keep the language simple. The simpler the language, the easier it is for people to understand your work. Correct? There are tools like Grammarly is one tool that I know of. There are other tools like this where you can write it, keep it simple. There are tools that will check your grammar, maybe even suggest wording changes to you. Right? So you have tools that are out there that you can use for this purpose, but keep the language simple. Make sure that you have cited all the papers, right? In all of your literature review, anything that you're referring to in the paper, it needs to be there in the list of references. Make sure that you have covered all the necessary details of your work, right? So it's not just the literature review, but also the design, the method, and the analysis. And when you're writing up the paper, stay within the scope of your project. We have a tendency sometimes, especially with the introduction, to start very broad, right? We start from a very broad picture and then try to narrow it down. It is very distracting. Get closer to the scope of your work, right? And whatever you write, stay within the scope of your work. Even when you come to your conclusion section, you don't want to claim that you have solved all the world's problems through your research project, right? Describe specifically the contributions that arise from your work. What is the scope of your work? Stick within that. Okay. So now that you have written a paper, my suggestion before you submit a paper to a journal, find somebody who can do a friendly review. They just tell them to read it, give their feedback. That's all. This can be another friend of yours or a colleague of yours who's interested in research. As long as a person is interested in research and is willing to spend some time, you can ask them to do a friendly review of your paper. Keep in mind that whatever feedback they give you is their individual opinion. It is not necessarily the best, or it's not necessarily the worst quality of comment that you can get. It is just their opinion, right? But getting somebody to give you feedback may help identify some things that you may have missed when you were writing the paper, right? So that's why that's very useful. You don't want the reviewers to be the people to point those things out to you if you can fix it yourself, right? So that's where this friendly review comes in. Typically a friend, anybody who's willing to spend some time reading your paper is good, right? And by the way, that also includes people who are not necessarily people in your field, okay? You can ask a friend who's not working in your own area Let them read it and just tell them, ask them what they think of the paper, right? It will give you some useful insights more often than not. Okay. So now when you get ready to submit the paper to the journal, hopefully you have chosen the journal before you've written the paper, right? So you want to write the paper specifically for a journal, but choose the right type of journal, the research area, as well as the level of contribution. Now, a cover letter becomes necessary at this stage. So a senior editor sometimes does not have time to even read the introduction section, right? So let's say they get hundreds of or thousands of papers and they have to read all of them, and only 30% of them are going for review. Sometimes they don't have time to read even the introduction section. The cover letter is sort of you take your abstract and you rewrite it in such a way that it's a short one or two paragraphs at the most, right? Maybe half a page at the most, summarizing your paper. Why is your paper a contribution? More important than the summary, what is the contribution of your paper, right? That's what needs to be in this cover letter. Okay. Most journals, they use some kind of an online submission portal, and this cover letter, they ask you to copy and paste it into a box in their system, and that's how they typically do it. It's not a separate letter on paper nowadays. A lot of journals will ask you to suggest reviewers. For this, my suggestion to you is take a look at the people whose papers you have been citing in your literature review. Those are the potential reviewers themselves. Don't suggest names of your friends. In fact, most journals will tell you that don't suggest names of people with whom you have co-authored any paper in the last so many years. Don't suggest your own professors or anybody like that, or colleagues, right? So if they ask you to suggest reviewers, good names to suggest are other people who are working in the same area. Okay. Some journals ask you to provide your data set, and they will give you the instructions for how to share your data. So they may ask you to post it on a website. There are some sites that will allow you to post the data in an anonymous manner and provide a link, and other people can download that data. So each journal has their own set of requirements for this, and they will give you the details. The authorship is important, especially the corresponding author, because all of the email message that comes from the submission system is going to go to the corresponding author, all the reviewers' comments and things like that. So if you have multiple authors on the paper, make sure that the corresponding author is somebody who checks their email and will respond to email properly. Okay. Most journals will ask you also to acknowledge any kind of funding or research support. So if you've got funding from your institution, let's say from your university, or if you're working for a corporate and the company has supported your research, you need to acknowledge this. They typically ask for this. Okay. So this is basically the mechanics of submitting the paper to a journal. Now it goes through the review process. Each and every journal may have their own things in the review process, so understand what their process is. The submission portal will typically update the status as soon as something happens. So check the portal. Please do not send email to the editors. You are just going to irritate them, right? So unless it's a very long time, like if it's like 6 months or 10 months or something like that, and you have not heard, then it is appropriate. But otherwise, be patient. When you get the reviewers, when you get the reviewers' comments, read them very carefully. Now, keep in mind that you may have worked very hard on this paper. You have worked very hard, first of all, on the research project, and then you have worked very hard on writing the paper. So when the reviewers' comments come, sometimes they can be rude, sometimes they can be nasty, right? You have to learn how to not get affected by that, right? Maybe sometimes if their reviewers comments come and it's not what you were expecting and it is very negative, maybe what you want to do is just close the file, don't look at it for a few days, come back after you have calmed down. But what you want to do is go through those observations of the reviewers very carefully and think in terms of how do their recommendations help to improve your paper. If the reviewers are good, so here is where sending your paper to a good quality journal makes a difference. In good quality journals, the people who do the reviews are also very good researchers, and their reviewers' comments are very useful to you, right? So if you read their comments carefully, even though it may be very tough to do those changes or those revisions, it will help to improve your paper a lot. So read those comments carefully and look at it from the perspective of, how do those recommendations help you improve your paper? Okay. When you revise and resubmit your paper, you have to include a document of some kind where you show how you have responded to the reviewer's comments. And my suggestion to you is create a spreadsheet again, put each comment down in one row, and then next to that, you put a cell which shows what is the action that you have taken. Okay. So every single comment, you want to show how you have responded to that. Do not be defensive. Explain and explain what you have done and why you have done the way that, how you have responded to those comments, and address those comments. They will be happy. Okay. The more clear you are, the better. Don't try to hide behind something and say that it is not appropriate comment, or it is not relevant. Don't put it in those terms. Just go ahead and address it. It's going to help improve your paper. Once your paper is accepted, so now let's say you've gone through the review process, your paper is accepted. Now what happens is there's typically some final revisions that they'll still ask you to do. There is formatting that you have to do to fit the journal's design formatting. Most times the journal will ask you to give the copyright of the paper to them. So you release the copyright of the paper to them. This means that you no longer have copyright over the paper. The journal has the copyright of the paper. Okay. And that copyright means the form of that particular paper, they own it, all the figures, all the tables, they have the copyright for that. Okay. Some journals will send you what are known as proofs, the page proofs. They will send you the formatted version of the paper for you to do a final review before it actually appears. Nowadays, most papers appear online fairly quickly. So soon after the paper is accepted, it appears online. And the print version may or may not come. Some journals are electronic only. Some journals do have paper versions of the journal, but that may come later. But the online version comes fairly soon. Okay. When the online version comes, you typically are able to download that file. But based on the copyright release that you have signed, you do not have the right to distribute those soft copies. Okay. So be careful when you distribute those soft copies, understand what the journal guidelines are. So what you can do is the version of the paper prior to formatting for the journal, that typically they will allow you to. So the content of the paper you can share, but not the way it is formatted for the journal. Okay. So this is where you need to be careful before you distribute soft copies of your paper. Follow the journal guidelines carefully. The publisher or the journal will explain to you what is appropriate. Okay. So to recap what we have been talking about now for some time, I'm hoping that you got an understanding of what should be the objective of writing a paper. So why do you want to write a paper, right? So some people think that writing a paper gives you prestige and glory. That's not really the objective that you should be thinking of. It should be really about how do you share your work? How do you share your work and explain the contributions that you have made through your work, right? It could be that your project may be simple, your project may be small, but the contribution of that project is still valuable to somebody. And you want to write that paper so that other people can make use of that contribution that you have made. Okay. Understanding the review process, you need to have an idea of how this review process works, because when you go through that, you can avoid a lot of problems, right? So if you don't know the process of each specific journal and what to look for, you may write up the paper in an incorrect manner. And then it does not go through the review process because of those mistakes. And those are avoidable mistakes. So understanding the review process is important. Okay. The key elements of a research paper, you have to cover all of those points. Now, each of those points are, when you apply it to your specific paper, it's going to be different. You need to figure out what is the best thing to do for each of those elements for your specific research paper. And the most important thing, through the writing of your paper, you want to make sure that your research contribution has been clearly emphasized. Okay. So before I wrap up, I've got some links to a few sample papers. I've also got links to a few set of online resources. All of these PDF files, and I have shared with the organizers and You can get it from them, including this presentation file also I have provided, so you can get it from them. Okay. So let me conclude by saying all the best with your writing and with the submission process. I hope that you will find success, and I really hope that you will take the time and effort to write those research papers, because that's what would make me most happy. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Let me, I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you very much, Professor Abraham, for sharing your invaluable knowledge and experiences with us. Your insights have been truly enlightening and informative. We are extremely grateful to you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to provide us with such important information. On behalf of the IIT Young Professionals SriLanka, IIT Young Professionals Bangalore, IIT on Campus University of Peradeniya, and IIT on Campus KDU, I would like to express our sincere appreciation for your contribution to today's webinar. Now, it's time for a Q&A session. We encourage you to ask any questions you may have regarding today's webinar by using the chat box. Alternatively, you may also unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. Once again, thank you, Professor Abraham, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. Okay, there was a question from Shania about using ChatGPT to write the paper. The full question did not show up, but my understanding is can you use ChatGPT to write the paper, even if as long as ChatGPT does not bring up the research itself? This is a touchy area. Okay, the reason being, ChatGPT may not necessarily give you right things. ChatGPT is still experimental. It's very powerful, but it is still experimental. Okay. I was reading recently that when people were asked to read ChatGPT produced text, they were easily able to identify it, because it does not reflect the level of reasoning that you expect from a researcher. It is a very basic level of reasoning. So when you start trying to write a research paper, it may not give you something that is of good quality, right? Now, this may change a few years from now. After ChatGPT keeps getting better, it may get better. I'm not sure. Okay. But be very, very careful at this point in time. My suggestion to you is write it in your own words first. Then use tools like ChatGPT to clean up your writing. Okay. That way, your idea, your thought process, that sequence of thought is there first, right? ChatGPT or Grammarly can be used up to clean the language part of it. Look at using it that way. Okay. But my suggestion to you is, do not rely on ChatGPT for the writing. Not at this stage. It's not good at this stage. And here's the thing. If you're serious about research, you also have to be serious about writing. And writing is a skill that you develop by writing. You cannot learn it in one step. It is not something that will happen by magic. It happens only by practice. So you have to start writing on your own and by yourself. Otherwise, you will not become a good researcher over time. Okay. But if you're trying to use GPT, you're scared about your language itself, then write it first in your own language. Whatever mistakes you make, it's okay. Run it through ChatGPT. Try to get it to improve it, and then you move on. Okay.
Thank you, sir. So the next question we have for you is, what's the difference between primary and secondary literature?
Did you mean primary data and secondary data, or primary literature and secondary literature?
Primary and secondary literature, sir.
Okay, I'm not sure about what you mean by primary. Let me talk about both those things. So primary data is data that you have collected on your own. Secondary data is data that somebody else has collected. So let's say, for instance, you have some economic data collected by some government agency. That is secondary data. But if, let's say, for instance, you have a survey and you collect economic data on your own, that is primary data, okay? Now, when it comes to literature, some of the literature can be very specific to your research project, and that's what I think is meant by primary. I have not seen this use before. Secondary literature could be other literature that is more peripheral to your work, but not necessarily directly connected to your work. Okay?
Thank you, sir. The next question is, are there any tools we can use for referencing?
The simplest tool that you can use is Google itself. So go to the site scholar.google.com. Instead of just going to www.google.com, go to scholar.google.com, search for your papers from there. When those papers come, at the bottom of each of those search results, you will see a link called Cite. When you click on Cite, it gives you the citation for that paper in different formats. Keep in mind that Scholar.google gives you only 2 or 3 formats. It may not be the one that is most appropriate for your journal. So you need to know the journal that you're going to submit the paper to, what is the format that they want, and how do you put that reference in that format. So in Google's citation that they give you, the information that you need is going to be there. You may still have to reformat it, okay? There is a piece of software called Keynote. This is a paid software, right? Keynote is supposed to allow you to create the template for different journals and use it. But even if you're using Keynote, you need to manually go and check at the end before you submit the paper, because Keynote can make mistakes. Microsoft Word has got a referencing tool that is built in. It works similar to Keynote. Microsoft's tool also has problems in that it is not 100% accurate. It is accurate most of the time, but it does make mistakes. You still have to manually check everything before you submit the paper. Okay?
Thank you, sir. That brings us to the end of the Q&A session. I'd like to extend a sincere thank you again to our esteemed speaker, Professor Dolphy M, for sharing his valuable insights and expertise with us today. Your contribution have been truly enlightening and thought-provoking, and we are grateful for the knowledge you have imparted us. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you once again for having me. I really enjoyed this.
And now, I invite the chairperson of IET Young Professionals SriLanka, Engineer Indura Amal, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thanks, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Very good evening, everyone. I'm Indura Amal, chairperson of IET Young Professionals SriLanka network. Well, I hope you all had a great evening today and got a really good knowledge on writing a research paper. So I hope this will help and guide you all to write a perfect research paper and publish it in a reputed journal. I want to remind, we have just a platform that would lead the way for it. That is IET Young Professionals Technical Paper Conference. There you will get the chance to present your paper to a panel of judges. Judges consist with expertise from industry as well as academia. So please check the IET YP SriLanka network FB and LinkedIn pages. You will get the more details from these. So, well, without taking much time, on behalf of IET Young Professionals SriLanka network, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our guest speaker of the day, Dr. Dolphy M, for accepting our invitation to spare time amidst all your busy schedules, and for sharing your valuable knowledge and experience with us. So, thank you for joining here. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to the IIT Young Professionals Bangalore network for taking hands with us on organizing this valuable session. Also, I would like to thank IIT on Campus University of Peradeniya and IIT on Campus University of Kothalawala Defence University for hosting this event on behalf of IIT Young Professionals SriLanka. You guys did a great job on organizing this event. Finally, I would like to thank all the participants for participating in today's event. Without you all, this won't be a success. Last but not least, I want to thank all the on-campus volunteers and organizing the committee for the job well done. Marking the end of the session, we are winding up. Thank you and have a good night. Over to you, Bimbara.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for attending today's program. We hope you found this session informative and useful for your research paper writing and publishing endeavors. Before we conclude, we would like to remind you about the upcoming Young Professionals Technical Conference. You can find more information about YPTC on our Facebook pages. So don't miss this chance to showcase your talents. Before we wrap up, we kindly request you to take a moment to provide us with your valuable feedback through the link provided in the chat box. Your feedback will help us to improve our future sessions and events. In addition, we would also like to remind those who have not yet filled out the attendance form to please do so now. It's an important step in ensuring that we have an accurate record of all attendees. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming sessions. Stay connected with us for more exciting events and activities. Keep in touch. Until then, have a good night.